This conference will now be recorded.
So tonight on the call, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce everyone who's here on the screen. So as I mentioned, joining us tonight are Bobby Gauthier, Senior Project Manager at WSP, and Kristen Harrison, the Township's Project Manager. I'm going to pass the microphone off to Kristen to introduce the counselors who've been able to join us this evening and share a few words.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for making time to participate in the Township's Rural Zoning Bylaw Review. The project team is excited and looking forward to hearing it from you throughout this review process. And listening in on our discussion this evening, we have Mayor Pellegrini as well as Councillor Eek. And so thank you too for being here with us this evening and listening in on the discussion that we're going to have. And I'll turn it back over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And then just before I pass the floor to Bobby to walk through the presentation, just wanted to remind everyone of a couple sort of housekeeping items. So as I mentioned, the meeting is being recorded, and everyone who's joined the meeting will be muted until the Q&A session. And before we kick off the question and answer session, I'll walk through how that'll work in a bit more detail. The chat function that I mentioned is sort of that bubble in the top right corner of your screen. So if you click that and select the everyone option, you're able to share your comments and questions. And we'll answer those in the order that they're received at the end of the presentation. So now I'll pass the presentation over to Bobby Gauthier from WSP, and he'll walk through the rest of the presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate the introduction. Like my friend Kristen and Matt, I'm also very excited to be here this evening. I see a lot of familiar faces and some familiar names joining us this evening, so it's good to see you again. And unfortunately, we couldn't be together in person, but I hope that will change before the course of the project is through. So as Matt mentioned, my presentation's about 30 minutes or so. I've got a few objectives. I'll be walking through the purpose of today's open house, the purpose of the overall project. I will talk about the timeline and the process that we'll be undertaking. And then I'll spend probably the bulk of the presentation going over some key issues and opportunities that we want to address in this project. So what are we doing here today? So this is actually our first round of open houses on the Rural Zoning Bylaw Review. We're doing 3 open houses. We had one just a couple days ago. We're doing one tonight, and we've got another one next week. So the purpose of this first round of meetings, of course, is to introduce the project, to kick it off, and to provide some information as to the kinds of things that we're going to address in the process and opportunities for you to be involved and to provide your input as we move forward. The overall purpose of this project is fairly simple. We are writing a new zoning bylaw for King Township's rural areas, and that includes the hamlet areas. So there's a number of different things that we'll be able to accomplish in that project. It's really an opportunity to modernize the zoning standards, to implement provincial policy, to implement Township of King policy, and we're hoping to achieve those objectives as we move forward. So the purpose of the project, like I said, it's about writing a new bylaw and replacing the bylaw that's in effect now. If you're familiar with the Township's current rural zoning, it's currently subject to zoning bylaw 74-53, which of course insinuates that the bylaw was passed back in 1974. So it's been quite a long time since the Township's been able to review its zoning comprehensively. It's been updated, it's been amended many times over the years, as the Township's had to do, but this really is, I think, the first really comprehensive review of that zoning. Next slide, please, Matt. So what is our study area? So when I say that we're developing a new zoning bylaw for the rural area, what land am I talking about? I'm actually talking about the bulk of the Township of King, in fact. The only areas that I'm not talking about, the areas not subject to the study, are the areas that have already received brand new zoning bylaws recently. So you may know that the Nobleton urban area, Schaumburg and King City, have been subject to recent new zoning bylaw review processes, and there's new zoning bylaws in effect. So now we're going about addressing the zoning for the rest of the township. So the outcome of this process is new zoning effectively for the entirety of the township. So what you see on the screen here is a map. Basically anything that's shaded in yellow is part of our study area and will be addressed through this project. Next slide, please, Matt. So as I mentioned, the township, it's not new to updating and modernizing its zoning bylaws. It's been doing that for quite some time now. Back in 2014, the township initiated a review of the zoning in the Nobleton urban area, which you see outlined on the slide. And that process resulted in Bylaw 2016-71, a brand new bylaw for Nobleton. That process was followed by another zoning review process, resulting in Bylaw 2017-66 for Schaumburg and King City. And now we'll be addressing the zoning for the rest of the township, effectively, coming full circle and completing the last phase of the project. Next slide, please. So before I get too far, it's probably, worthwhile for me to spend a moment and just describe, what a zoning bylaw is. So a zoning bylaw is a municipal bylaw. It's a document that is administered and enforced by the township. It's a legal tool. It's a legal document. It's not a York Region bylaw, or it's not provincial law, but it is the township's own bylaw that it administers. It's a very detailed bylaw. Zoning bylaws regulate a lot of things. First and foremost, they regulate the use of land and buildings. So if you want to know what to do with what you can do with your property, you'd look to the zoning bylaw and you would identify what uses are permitted. Can you build a house? Can you operate a farm? Can you build a place of worship? What kinds of things can you do on your property? That's stated in the zoning bylaw. And the zoning bylaw also regulates a wide range of other matters related to built form. So things like setbacks. So how far from the lot lines must a building be located? We call that a setback. How big does the lot have to be? The minimum lot area. How wide does the lot have to be? We call that the lot frontage. And zoning bylaws, they also regulate things in so much detail. It gets right down to the accessory structures. So requirements for farm buildings, requirements for decks and sheds and fences and all these kinds of things can be addressed in a zoning bylaw. If you've used a zoning bylaw before, you'll know that the way zoning bylaws work is there's a map, and it basically divides the land into a bunch of different zone categories. So usually when you use a zoning bylaw, you'll flip to the back of the document, you'll take a look at that map, and you'll find what zone you're in. And that zone will typically tell you what uses are permitted on your property and what kinds of lot and building requirements apply. Now, the township's authority to pass zoning bylaws comes under the Planning Act. So it's the province that's created the opportunity for the township to use zoning as a planning tool. And certainly the township has been administering zoning throughout the township for many decades. And this process is about updating that zoning that's been in effect for so many years. Next slide, please. So what does the existing zoning look like in the rural area? And we produced this map using what's called geographic information systems data. So we took some data from the township that helps to characterize the zoning, and we've kind of laid it out in color just to kind of emphasize the composition of zoning in the township today. What kind of strikes me is you see all those green zones just spreading straight across the midsection of the township. That's the Oak Ridges Moraine area. And so the township at one point updated the zoning to implement new Oak Ridges Moraine zones. The rest of the township, it's a mix of zones. In large part, it's a series of different rural zones. There's, I think, principally two main rural zones. You see one of them applied largely in the Holland Marsh specialty crop area at the north end of the township. And then the other agricultural zone that you see applied through the bulk of the township. You also find instances of other zones, like there's instances of commercial zones, even industrial, institutional zones, and those typically relate to zones that were passed through a site-specific process at some point in the past. And now we have to look at that zoning and make sure that it's still up to date with the official plan and other documents, which I'll go over later. So all in all, there's 32 zoning categories currently administered by the township, and we'll be taking a look at that through this process. Next slide, please. So if we zoom down into the hamlets and take a look at the existing zoning in the hamlets, and again, we've used the GIS data and we've created these nice color maps that just help to make the zoning pop. What you can see is, the bulk of the neighborhoods and areas in the hamlets, at least these three hamlets, are zoned HR. HR is the hamlet residential zone. And one of the things we want to do in this project, is make sure that the hamlet residential zone is working. Is there a need to break down that zone further? Does it make sense to have a hamlet residential zone apply across these different communities, knowing that these different communities have different characteristics? Does the hamlet residential zone work, or does it need to be updated? That's the kind of thing we're looking at. And like the other map, you see instances of some other existing zones, commercial and institutional zones that were passed through a previous approval process, and we'll need to be looking at that to ensure policy conformity. Next slide, please. So similarly, if we look at the other four hamlets, a little bit different, except Lloydtown, you can see it's largely consisting of the hamlet residential zone, but the other hamlets, it's more of a mix of zones. You see some of these RU1, this rural zone, applying to some of these neighborhoods, kind of raises the question, does the RU1 zone work? Does it reflect the character of these different lots and areas? So that, again, that's something we'll be looking at and wanting to update. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the process for undertaking this review? You can appreciate already it's probably going to be a lot of work. So how are we going to get that done? We're approaching the project effectively with about a year to year and a half time frame. And looking for completion by fall of next year. We're undertaking the project in a series of phases. We're in phase one. Like I said, we're largely launching the project, and the main purpose of phase one is to produce a discussion paper. And that's what we're here to present today, is the findings of that discussion paper. The discussion paper is a document that helps us to understand at a high level, what do we need to update in the zoning bylaw? We can't just jump into the zoning bylaw and write a new one. We need to take a step back and figure out, what is our work plan? What are the things that we need to update in the zoning that aren't working? So phase one ongoing, we're looking to wrap it up. Not so much the end of this year. I think we'll still be open to comments, but probably early next year as we target a presentation to council. So we're doing a series of consultation activities as part of phase one, this round of open houses. I'll be showing you the website just after the presentation, and I'll show you different opportunities to provide input there. We're also thinking about, is there a desire to have topic-specific workshops with people, or even one-on-one meetings early in the new year to kind of dive into issues in more detail that people want to talk about with us. And phase one will culminate in a presentation to council. We'll revise the discussion paper based on the information we receive, and then we will post that on the website and then seek council's endorsement and support to move forward to phase two. Phase two will involve actually drafting the rural zoning bylaw. So once we get a sense of the discussion paper's completion and we know the kinds of changes we'll have to make, we'll draft the bylaw. We anticipate releasing the draft bylaw in June of 2021. And in conjunction with that, we'll host a series of open houses, and we'll probably have other opportunities for engagement and involvement. I don't know in June 2021 if we're still going to be all virtual or if we're going to have the opportunity for in-person. I certainly hope we can be in person at some point in this process, but I think we'll have to stay nimble and we'll just adapt to the changing circumstances as we move forward. And then phase three involves finalizing the bylaw. So we'll receive input, take a look at that, address it, issue a comments matrix to respond to the input we receive. We'll have some more public meetings, and then we will present that bylaw for adoption. And the target for that, like I said, is October of next year. Next slide, please. So why is the project being completed? What's wrong with the rural zoning? Why is the township updating it? I think there's kind of three really overarching objectives to the project. The first to me is implementing the township's official plan, as well as other policy, provincial policy. So if you know anything about the official plan, I'll talk about it on the next slide, but the official plan is a key planning document. And one of our responsibilities in this process is to ensure that the zoning bylaw quote unquote conforms to the official plan. That's a stated requirement in the Planning Act. So we need to be looking at the zoning to make sure it's in alignment with the official plan and other provincial policy. We also need to be modernizing and improving the zoning bylaw. Writing a new zoning bylaw is a great opportunity to do something, innovative and modern and progressive. And I think also it's an opportunity to improve customer service, allow people the opportunity to better check the zoning on their own property, and also to improve efficiency on township staff end. A new zoning bylaw might mean fewer zoning applications, fewer minor variances, right? So there's a lot of benefits to doing this project. And then finally, I think another objective is simply reflecting, recent studies, but also modern farming practice, modern farming trends. Is the zoning bylaw out of date with modern farming practice? Does it need to be updated to reflect, this idea of having on-farm diversified uses and expanding economic viability of farm operations in the community? Right? These are the kinds of things we can address on this project. Next slide. Just have a little sip here. So I've mentioned a few times that there's this really important relationship between the official plan and the zoning bylaw. The official plan is the township's document. It's a strategic document. It's a document that guides council's decision making, and it basically sets out a framework and a strategy for growth, development, and land use. If you look at the official plan, you'll find kind of broader policy. It'll say things like, at a high level, some uses are not permitted here, but they are permitted over here. It's written in a very high level way. And the role of the zoning bylaw is to take those high level policies in the official plan and turn them into detailed regulations. The one thing, I always say this phrase, the zoning bylaw has to conform to the official plan. But what does that mean? I think the best way to describe what that means is to say that the zoning bylaw cannot be more permissive than the official plan. So generally speaking, if the official plan is not allowing something to occur, then the zoning bylaw can't either. And part of the context on this slide too, I think, is to acknowledge, the role of provincial policy. We live in an environment which is pretty top down, right? The township has to take direction from the province. It's kind of limited in terms of some of the policies that it's established. So effectively, the zoning bylaw will also be implementing provincial policy in addition to sort of the local contextual considerations. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the first half of the presentation. The second half is to walk through the key issues and opportunities that we identified in the discussion paper. And I'll show the website at the end, but you can get the discussion paper from the website, speaking.king.ca, and I would direct people to section 6. Section 6 is the chapter of the document that goes over 14 key issues and opportunities and provides some high-level directions and some recommendations about how to move forward to write the new bylaw. It's also generally just a good document if you're looking for some general orientation about what this project is all about. I think the discussion paper is a good resource for that. Next slide, please. So the discussion paper in section 6 looks at 14 key issues. I'm not going to read them all off now because I've got an individual slide for each one of these issues, which we'll walk through. But I think suffice it to say, it's a discussion paper because we're open to having discussion about the content in that document, right? We're releasing it in draft, looking for input and looking to really draw on the knowledge of the community. I think that that's going to be really key to the success of this project. So let's start diving into the issues. Next slide, please. So the first issue that we're going to be looking at in this project is sort of this question of how do we package up the new rural zoning bylaw? Should we have sort of the standalone rural zoning bylaw document, or should we consider consolidating all of the township's existing and recent zoning bylaws and have a township-wide one? I think suffice it to say, it's kind of an administrative question. It's, either way, whichever approach you take, you can still have a great zoning bylaw, but it is a matter of administration. And I think there's just pros and cons to either approach. You know, I think in my experience in the township, there was a lot of desire to see the documents separate because they have, you know, they address different topics and they address different areas. And certainly I'm open to that if that's the preferred approach moving forward. Next slide, please. The second key issue, we need to be ensuring that the new zoning bylaw implements the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan. The map on the slide kind of shows some of the area in the legend. It's a bit hard to see. It's kind of a mix of different greens, but if you remember the zoning map I showed earlier, Oak Ridges Marine is kind of that central swath of land across the township. And the township undertook a zoning review after the Oak Ridges Marine Plan was completed. And so the township has largely implemented this document in zoning, but you know, we think there's a need to review that, in particular because the province has updated that plan in 2017. We want to make sure that there are no, or maybe there are some implications on the zoning, and we want to make sure that the zoning is very consistent with this document. The Oak Ridges Marine Plan, if anybody's familiar with it, is a very prescriptive plan. It's kind of embedded in regulations under the Associated Act. So, you know, we got to make sure that the zoning bylaw is very consistent with that document. Next slide, please. The third one, I kind of alluded to this already in the presentation, is we're going to be looking at the hamlet area zoning from a bunch of different perspectives. I think one perspective is we need to be making sure that the zoning in the hamlets, you know, is reflective of the individual character of each of the hamlets. And you can see, looking at all these hamlets and the zoning on the slide, they share the same zones. They share an HR zone, they share RU zones, and we need to be asking ourselves, do those zones work? Do those standards reflect the unique aspects of the communities? So we'll want to be updating that. That might involve breaking down the zones into more zones and making similar updates to better reflect the character of these areas. We also have to be looking at land use compatibility. You know, through the official plan review, there have been a few changes to some of the land use designations in the hamlets. You know, a couple of industrial sites are now designated by the official plan for different uses for a change of use. So we need to be looking at the zoning to make sure that it's consistent with these emerging policy directions, and to the extent we can, trying to address those compatibility issues in the context of this project. So those are a couple of the things that we'll be addressing through this project when it comes to the hamlets. Next slide, please. So secondary residential units, a little bit cut off there. So these go by all kinds of different names, and it seems like the name of these things changes every year or two by the province. I think the current name right now is additional residential units. But through this project, we need to be making sure that we're contemplating the permission of these uses. A secondary residential unit refers to, you know, a basement apartment, but it might also refer to an accessory dwelling in a detached structure, but on the same lot, and certainly kind of secondary in terms of the scale and size of the principal dwelling. Under the Planning Act, municipalities are required to consider and contemplate the permission of these uses. You know, it's a big driver of the province to accommodate, you know, different types of housing options for people, including more affordable housing options. And certainly I think secondary residential units can be a source of relatively affordable housing. As I said, the province directs this to be considered, and we need to be reviewing the zoning to make sure that we've considered it appropriately in the context of the rural areas. Next slide, please. The Holland Marsh specialty crop area. So again, I think we have the opportunity in this process to review and update the zoning. And this is kind of my question to the community is, you know, does the existing zoning in the Holland Marsh area work? You know, I think there is sort of a zone that's kind of dedicated to this area, but does it work? Do the setbacks make sense? You know, do the lot and building requirements make sense? You know, are the definitions consistent with modern farm practice? And are there special issues and considerations we need to be making when we update the zoning? Obviously, this is an important area in the township. We want to make sure that the zoning is, you know, doing everything it can to support economic viability and protecting the agricultural operations in this area. Next slide, please. Issue number 6, small farm holdings. So small farm holdings refer to, existing small farms that don't meet the minimum lot area, as now required by the official plan and currently required by the zoning bylaw. And small farms might exist for a whole bunch of reasons. They might have been created many years ago and they continue to operate in that fashion. So I think, my question on this topic is, again, does the zoning work for small farm holdings? Does it make sense, or should we be thinking about different standards? Right? If you got a small farm, maybe the big rural setbacks aren't feasible to achieve. Or if you've got a lot of small farms, what does that do to the sort of the rural character of the community, right? And how do we manage that in the zoning? So those are kinds of the questions that we'll be looking to address. Agriculture-related uses. So an agriculture-related use is it's a specifically defined term used by the province, and it refers to a use that serves and supports a broad range of farm operations in an area. So it might be a grain drying operation. It might be a larger farmer's market. It might be a farm implement dealer, something along those lines. And generally speaking, the official plan, as well as provincial policy, provides guidance and permission around agriculture-related uses. Although generally they're subject to a site-specific rezoning process, because you have to make sure, if you are creating a new lot and if it is for an agricultural use, the township has to be satisfied that the proposal meets provincial requirements and meets local requirements. So usually these uses go through a rezoning process before they're permitted. Having said that, though, I do think that there's a role in the zoning bylaw to set out a framework and provisions where these uses are proposed. So we can create a new zone, like a rural industrial zone or a rural commercial zone, and set out appropriate standards to guide these kinds of uses moving forward. Next slide, please. Sort of related to that is another provincial term, on-farm diversified uses. On-farm diversified uses refers to those accessory uses that exist on a farm and are kind of supportive of the overall farming operation, right? It's about contributing to the economic viability of the farm, just expanding these opportunities for farm operators, but in a way that doesn't impact the farming community broadly. I think there's an opportunity for the rural zoning bylaw to permit these things as of right, not necessarily to require a rezoning, but to say certain on-farm diversified uses are contemplated, and here are some standards to go along with them. I think there's a lot of opportunity in this project in particular to be really innovative in this, and I'm really hoping this is one area where members of the community can get involved and share some thoughts as to, what kinds of uses are modern and would support farming operation and should be contemplated in the zoning bylaw. So hopefully we can start to draw on local knowledge in that regard. Next slide, please. So the next item, bed and breakfasts and short-term accommodations. So this refers to, this idea where someone might rent out a part of their house, or they might rent out a house on Airbnb or something like that as a commercial use. So I think there's different forms of short-term accommodations. Bed and breakfasts, a bed and breakfast can actually be an on-farm diversified use, right? But typically a bed and breakfast refers to, the operator of the bed and breakfast lives there and they rent out a few of the rooms and maybe they provide breakfast the next day, right? A short-term accommodation, and I'm sure people on the call have seen, all kinds of different articles and news articles about, issues and impacts associated with these kinds of things, where, especially where someone, purchases a home for the purposes of solely renting it out, and then you get all these, impacts in terms of noise and nuisance and that sort of thing. So I see this process as being an opportunity to set out some regulations. What makes sense in terms of the township? Does it make sense to contemplate and permit bed and breakfasts, but maybe be a little bit less permissive on short-term accommodations, especially if that's the entire use of the property? Next slide, please. Major recreational uses, so referring to things like, golf courses, large playing fields, campgrounds, and ski hills. generally speaking, new major recreational uses cannot be established as of right. There has to be a pretty significant planning process that occurs. And I think currently, based on York Region's official plan, you have to actually go through an official plan amendment, if I'm not mistaken, to permit a major recreational use, at least in some areas of the township. So there's definitely going to be this big process that occurs. I don't see us, pre-zoning or adding new permissions where they don't exist now. But I do see the role of the zoning bylaws to establish minimum standards for new proposed major recreational uses. We might create a zone that addresses these uses and has desirable lot and building requirements to ensure that they meet the township's objectives when it comes to rural character, when it comes to environmental impact and that sort of thing. Next slide. Source water protection. So again, another thing that we'll want to do in this project is to implement some of the requirements of the province when it comes to protecting drinking water sources. And there's a few wellheads in the township, and the province has produced a series of source protection plans. And those source protection plans include some restrictions around certain kinds of activities that occur that could represent a threat to drinking water, but mainly industrial activities, which normally wouldn't really be permitted in the rural area anyway. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to be reviewing and updating the zoning to ensure that we're not being more permissive than what the source protection plans say. Again, this is another one of those cases where we're receiving direction from the province, and we want to make sure that we're being consistent with that. Next slide. Yep. Natural heritage and hazards. So again, I think the official plan, of course, has a bold set of policies for strongly protecting the natural environment, and seeing a natural heritage system, restored and improved over time throughout the township. And I do think the rural zoning bylaw plays a role in supporting the implementation of those policies and conserving the environment. Certainly at a minimum, we're going to want to have a suitable environmental protection zone. We'll carry forward anything that's currently zoned for environmental protection purposes. And I also think there's an opportunity for us to look at the potential to, either update the zoning for floodplains or update the zoning for natural heritage where there has been a really good detailed study, like a recent development application where we can kind of draw on that information and delineate those features in the zoning. So there are some opportunities there. Next slide. Almost done, I promise. Okay, sustainability and climate change, issue number 13. So again, I see the rural zoning bylaw as having a role when it comes to both mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And I have a few ideas about what that might mean. The first one is one opportunity is to establish requirements for pervious surfaces, minimum pervious surfaces. That was something that we did when we worked on the zoning bylaws in the villages. We introduced a minimum percentage of a lot area that has to be maintained as a pervious surface. And the purpose of that is to ensure that there's going to be some minimum area that allows water to permeate and infiltrate into the ground. Now, I don't necessarily think that a minimum pervious surface requirement is all that relevant in an agricultural zone, but maybe it's more relevant in the hamlet areas. Supporting and encouraging local food access, I think, is also really important. And I talked about this a little bit when it came to on-farm diversified uses. If we're encouraging, and I shouldn't use the word encourage, that's not really what the zoning bylaw does. If we're permitting farm stands and those kinds of things, are we supporting and reinforcing that local food network? Right? I do think that there is some opportunity and a role for the zoning bylaw in that regard. And then, as I said before, we do have the opportunity in this process to update the zoning for floodplains and hazardous lands. So those are a few ideas as to how we can, contribute to climate change objectives and policies through this process. And the final issue, number 14, cannabis production uses. So, we're looking at the opportunity and the need to introduce and update requirements for cannabis uses. And that's certainly something that's been on the township's radar for a few years now. I think suffice it to say that's something the township continues to work through, and we'll continue to work with the township on that, and then we'll be carrying forward ultimately the new standards into the new zoning bylaw. And then the last slide, Matt. All right, so that's a mouthful. I really appreciate everybody listening to all of that. It's a lengthy presentation. There's a lot to do in this project. You know, we're hoping that everyone can stay informed and you know, get involved in the project. And what I would like to do, just before I review the rest of that slide, is give a bit of a demonstration of the township's website. And Matt is...
I gave you presenter status.
Perfect.
It might have dropped my screen.
It did, yes.
Okay.
It did. So I'll just go right ahead and share the website. So
and just while Bobby does that, feel free to answer or enter your questions or comments in the chat box based on the discussion we just had, and we'll get to those after this.
For sure, absolutely. So if you've never been to speaking.king.ca before, it's the township's kind of central landing page for all the different planning projects it has going on. Really convenient website, links to all the major stuff with nice little convenient progress bars in the corner. The rural zoning bylaw review currently is just right at the top right of that page. And that takes you to our main landing page for this project. I'll point out a few things. On the top right, there is a field for entering your email address so you can stay informed as the project moves forward. Just below that, an FAQs with some general questions. There's a few important links, and click on them, but this is where if you want to check the current zoning on a property, there's a few links to do that. There's a link to the township's interactive map where you can check the zoning, and links to the zoning bylaw PDFs, as well as the official plan. There's a summary of the timeline, and then down here at the bottom right is where you can download the discussion paper, and all the other reports that we produce on the project will be posted there. Kristen's contact information, bottom right. And then going to the center of the page, you know, this will stay updated. So, you know, once we get past the open houses, we'll post some information about what our next steps are, and we'll update this text. And then just down below, there's a series of different kind of interesting tabs here. There's a news feed which we can keep updated and post announcements as we move forward. If you click on map, it will open this page. I'm just going to click on it quickly, so I want people to have a look at this one. So we enabled this sort of interactive mapping tool because we wanted to, you know, again, maximize opportunities for participation, and we thought this might be something kind of neat that people might be a bit keen about. So the purpose of the map, we're asking people simply to kind of use the map and drop little pins to provide comments. And there's two kinds of pins. You'll see that you have to sign in to use it. I'm not signed in at the moment. I won't do that, but all you have to do is click on the pin and kind of drag it and drop it, and it lets you add some comments. And we're asking for two kinds of comments. You know, to help us build provisions for on-farm diversified uses, agriculture-related uses, we want to hear from the farming community in King Township. So we're asking people to put information about your farm, about maybe your plans in the future, or some of the challenges that you've had with the zoning bylaw. And then the blue pen is for adding any other comment that you'd like to make. So if you want us to know about a zoning issue, please feel free to use that as well. And then going back to the page, if you click on the Q&A tab, you can actually post questions, and the team will endeavor to respond to you ASAP on that. So we're hoping this is another great feature people take advantage of. And then finally, there's a survey. So we've posted a broad survey. You just have to click the link, sign in, and it'll provide some general questions about the project. So I think with that, Matt, I will stop sharing my screen if you wouldn't mind putting the the next step slide on.
I think it should be up now.
Yep, I got it. So yeah, we encourage people to check out the website, visit it regularly, contact Kristen with comments and questions. in terms of our next steps, again, so we'll be starting work, some preliminary internal technical work on the rural zoning bylaw in the coming weeks. Our intent is to be presenting the discussion paper to council in about February. So we are asking for comments by mid-January at the latest on that document. But that's not to say that that's the hard comment deadline either. I think we're generally just open to comments throughout the process. But in terms of ensuring we can integrate the comments on the discussion paper, we are asking for them by mid-January. And then you can expect to see the draft zoning bylaw released by June of 2021. So I think I will conclude the presentation. Thank everyone again for being here and see some familiar faces. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much, Bobby, and thanks so much for everyone who's joined us since we got started. I do recognize that some people are on a telephone, so you might not have access to the chat box. So there's a couple questions in the chat box we'll get to first, and then we'll head to the phones, as they say, and see if anyone else has questions. So just before we begin, just wanted to sort of review the housekeeping items again. So just because we have a number of people with us today, we are going to ask that you keep your comments and questions and ideas to 3 minutes. And after that, I'll pass it off to Bobby or to Kristen to answer that question or comment. And once we get through the whole group or all the questions that have been asked, we're happy to sort of go around for a second round. As I said, I'll call on individuals in the order that the question was asked, and then head over to the phones and see if anyone has questions. When it's your turn to speak, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you type your question in the comment box, I can speak it out to the group so everyone can hear it, and then Bobby and Kristen will respond. If you'd like to follow up with the project team or would like to discuss anything one-on-one, please do visit that speaking page that Bobby walked through for contact information or to submit questions using that question and answer tool that he demonstrated. And as Bobby sort of alluded to throughout his presentation, your input really is vital in this project. So before we begin, we do have one question in the chat box from Sandra. Sandra, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Hello. Oh, good, you can hear me, that's great.
Yeah.
It's a simple question. I just wanted a definition of what is a small operation. And for instance, as we all know through AMAFRA, you could have a 1 or 2 acre garlic farm. Is that considered small or large?
Perhaps I'll start with Bobby and an answer on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to respond to that. I don't know that we've yet defined, what a small farm is per se. I think my sort of overall definition at this point would be, any farm that wouldn't meet the minimum lot area as required by the township. And just to clarify too, when it comes to sort of the scope and what we're looking at when it comes to small farms, our sort of ask of the community is, is there a need to have a special zone? Is there a need to have, special setbacks or requirements to address kind of the unique needs of existing small farm operations? So that would kind of be the scope of work on that. So I hope that helps to clarify, but happy to take a follow-up question, Sandra.
No, not really, because you didn't define currently how the town is defining a small farm. You referred to it, that's why I asked the question. The lot size?
Sure. Yeah, by the lot size. So like I said, we haven't defined a small farm for the purposes of this project, but I think we have the opportunity to set what that is. Currently, I think, and maybe Kristen might remember better, in terms of minimum lot size in the official plan, I think it's minimum 10 hectares for the most part, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it's 100 or 40 hectares in the agricultural zone, and then I believe 10 in the specialty crop area, if I'm not mistaken. And then currently in the township zoning bylaw in the RU1 zone, so the rural general zone, right now our minimum lot size is 10 hectares, which is 25 acres for it to have a farm, a farm business.
It goes against OMAFRA.
That actually goes against OMAFRA, but that's interesting. Thank you.
It's a reason why we're updating our zoning bylaws to be consistent and current with the provincial plans.
Great.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is from Cher, and would you like to perhaps unmute yourself and ask the group?
Hi.
Hi, we can hear you good and clear.
Okay, good. We're here representing Snowball residents that really have had a hard go with industrial uses right on our front doorsteps. And I know that the township wants to fix this and has the spirit to do so, but you know, we thought we'd be involved with some of the discussions and we haven't been. And it sounds to me like now we just have to still wait. And I just want to know what's going to happen because it's our home.
Sure. Perhaps I'll start and kind of speak about the, sort of the scope of the zoning review on that issue, and then maybe Kristen would like to kind of jump in and offer some other context. So when it comes to the zoning bylaw review, there are a couple of industrial uses in a couple of the hamlets that are no longer designated for industrial purposes. So I think that the official plan was updated. And those lands are now designated for, I think, residential purposes or rural purposes, right? So in the scope of the zoning review, we need to be checking the zoning on those lands to see how it lines up with the official plan. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, those lands are zoned industrial, but designated by the official plan for residential. So in my mind, that represents a conflict, right? The current zoning is not consistent with what the official plan's future direction is. So I think we're going to have to be updating the zoning. In terms of what our options are, I think we've got a few in front of us. Firstly, we could leave the zoning as is, the status quo option, which I don't think does anything to implement the official plan. I don't think that's going to be an option that we'll be considering further. Another option is that we can update the zoning to simply only permit what's there now, and require any kind of expansion of that use to go through a rezoning process or a variance process. So we have a couple of options in front of us. I think in terms of the zoning, we definitely have to update it. We have to match the official plan. We even have the opportunity to. Another option is we could actually pre-zone what the official plan is intending for. So if the official plan is intending for residential uses, we could change that industrial zoning to a residential zone. And the outcome of that would mean that the current use would no longer comply with the zoning and would have to get kind of a minor variance to be able to expand the use. So we do have some tools to help kind of advance the issue a little bit, but in the context of this project. But I wonder maybe if Kristen has any other context from other processes or discussions that she's had.
Thanks, Bobby, and thanks, Cher. Cher, as you know, the official plan was recently updated and approved by York Region, and we have a number of appeals that have been received to the official plan. So we will be sorting through those in the coming weeks and months to try to scope those appeals and understand exactly what is in effect in the new official plan and move forward with the zoning from there. But there will be lots of discussions still to come in terms of what's happening in Snowball and what's happening with the industrial lands that are there now. So those conversations are still ongoing, and we're still looking for input. There's been the door isn't closed on that conversation yet.
Well, I understood that they received an exemption or an exception or whatever it was from the official plan for now. And I think our hopes were that there was going to be discussions with the industrial users and the township to help them move towards an idea of getting more residential in there and basically moving them to an area where they are not absolutely abusive to anyone who lives there, which is what we've been dealing with for, God, it's over 25 years now. So I listened to all the things that Matt just said, but none of them, except the one where suddenly things will all change and it'll go to residential, are very promising to us, to give them zoning that just, they've already been allowed to have zoning that they never had, and it was an illegal use from the get-go, and it just was allowed to continue. And in many ways, it just blows in the face of residents who bought their properties knowing that they had residential use, which we can no longer enjoy. We can't go out in our own yards. We can't. And I'm very frustrated that we keep asking, we keep coming back to the table, and it's always, yeah, we could do this, and it might be that, and it could be this. And I suppose I represent the whole group of us that we just want something done, something done. I mean, I thought by now, we're coming December now. We were talking about this all summer. And I know you're all trying, and I know it's a difficult position, but we're the victims of really neglect on the part of the township over the years to ensure that proper land uses were followed, and then to grandfather them and ignore the fact that we were there first, especially building like we have, a home for a disabled person. It's beyond belief that there's so much pink and ever expanding aggregates in Snowball. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. You've heard my stories before, and I was very hopeful that at this juncture we'd have an actual answer and not more. It could be this, could be that, might be that, I don't know, could be that. We'll have discussions, and nobody's called us or had discussions with us. So besides this opportunity, we feel a bit like mushrooms in the dark. So I know everyone's doing their job, so it's not that I'm angry, I'm just so frustrated. We would love to have an answer that makes sense to all the residents of Snowball for once, and not just make sense to the aggregates and the power of the provincial might. So I'm waiting, standing by. I look forward to any discussions, be happy to be involved, just want to be involved.
Well, thank you, Cher, for your comments, and I'll follow up with you after this evening, and we can discuss Snowball a little bit further.
Okay, that'd be good.
Thanks, Cher.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cher. The next question was from Susan, and she did send it just in the private setting. So I'll read it out if that's okay, Susan. So they're delighted to learn of the plans to look at innovative activities for farms and housing. And there seems to be new businesses all over the township in areas that are clearly not appropriate. Does this project, the Rural Zoning Bylaw Review, suggest that enforcement may ensue? Bobby, did you want to take a first cut at that one?
Yeah, happy to, for sure. So certainly I think, well, I'll say this, I think it's important that, this new zoning bylaw be an enforceable document. Like, that's absolutely a guiding principle of ours. We need to be writing regulations that are easy for the township to enforce. Like, I can promise you that that's a key guiding principle in this document. When it comes to sort of increased enforcement over, any existing operations of that nature, I think perhaps Kristen may want to respond to that, but I certainly think we can have the discussions around enforcement implications as a result of the zoning review process. Sometimes when you write a new zoning bylaw, you do realize that your provisions have become more complex, and you really need to be thinking about whether they're enforceable and what the game plan is to enforce them. Having a newer zoning bylaw with more modern provisions may actually increase the amount of effort required by staff to enforce and administer the bylaw. So I think that those are conversations that we'll absolutely be having. I'm not sure, Kristen, if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Thanks, Bobby. And not really add to it, but just to say that our bylaw enforcement division will be looking at the bylaw and will be helping us review it once we do have a draft, just to ensure that from their perspective, it's something that is enforceable.
Thanks so much, Bobby and Kristen. The next question and the last one in the queue. So if anyone else has a question, feel free to type it. Otherwise, after that, I will go to the phone, and just if anyone wants to unmute themselves to ask their question. Katie, did you want to ask your question to the group?
Sure. So my question is, and kind of bouncing off of what Cher had mentioned, will any of the topic-specific workshops that you actually mentioned earlier be community-specific reviews or visioning? because what I'm hearing and what I've also known from kind of from other contexts is that a lot of hamlets and areas don't get consulted more directly on their needs during the rezoning processes. And then they don't know what the actual, like how that fits into the vision of what the community wants to become. So I'm just wondering, you know, what are we doing when rural communities are specifically looking at, well, where are we going? There's a lot of, you know, weird stuff happening in the province, and people don't know what the community is going to look like. And so I'm really wondering, what does this process for you and for WSP and King Township, what is that really going to look like with residents and with direct communities who already have an idea or are looking for some guidance on where the community is going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
It's a great question. Thanks, Katie, for that. I think suffice it to say, you know, we haven't landed yet firmly on sort of the approach to the topic-specific workshops. One thing we wanted to do is have these open houses and start to get a feel from the community. You know, what are some of the things that the community wants to talk about? You know, and I've been hearing a few themes, you know, and I certainly think looking at the hamlets, you know, looking at maybe small farms, looking at on-farm diversified uses, I think could very well find their way as topic areas for workshops next year. So I think at this point, what I'll say is, you know, our intent would be to take away the comments and the questions we're getting, and we'll be designing some more workshop opportunities in the coming new year. And we'll keep the website up to date. Also, if anybody's signed up to the project, and certainly if you've registered for the open house, we'll make sure that you get, you know, updates as the project moves forward, and that you're aware of future consultation opportunities. But I certainly think that there's value at a minimum in having some kind of a workshop surrounding the hamlet communities, you know, either individually or you know, kind of clustering them into groups and having more in-depth discussions with the community about, you know, what the zoning looks like, what the official plan says about this community, what some of these emerging policy directions are. You know, we can kind of link these things back to the zoning bylaw and have a fulsome discussion. So I appreciate the comment, Katie. I think we'll take it away, and there's more to come in terms of the kinds of meetings that we'll be having soon. The other thing I'll just add really quickly is that we're also open to having one-on-one discussions. So if any residents, you know, a lot of people aren't comfortable necessarily having a conversation in a big group like this, but if you want to have more of a private or you know, a separate conversation to provide detailed input, we're also very happy to schedule those and have those conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Before we get to the next question in the queue, I'll just see if anyone on the phone who is unable to use the chat box did have a question. Give a quick second for you to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question. Okay, not hearing any, but we'll certainly come back and provide another opportunity to jump in. Nancy had a question. Nancy, did you want to ask the group, or I can certainly read that out if you'd like.
Just read it out.
Sure. So, Kristen, this question for you. You had mentioned that there had been sort of a number of appeals to the new King official plan. Can you tell us what areas and topics are being appealed?
Certainly. So we have received a number of appeals, and by a number, there's 12 appeals that we've received. The appeals are extensive at this time in terms of the number of policies. So the majority of Section 5 of the plan, which deals with the villages, as well as the policies with respect to the natural heritage system in Section 4, and a number of policies in Section 6, which deals with the rural areas and hamlets, have also been appealed. So we're at this point in time, we're really just taking a look at those appeals with our solicitors and trying to scope those appeals. We'll be doing that in the new year. We're also looking to report to council on the appeals, and we'll be taking that report forward in the early new year, and we're targeting January at this point to bring that report forward. So we're very early stages in terms of dealing with the appeals, but as we progress with dealing with those, we'll update the speaking page for the official plan review, and we'll also be updating council, so you can watch out for the council agenda in the new year. Is there any other follow-ups or no?
Could you send me a message when your report is going to council?
Certainly.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nancy. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box, so I will open the floor to anyone who either wants to maybe turn off the video, raise their hand, or unmute themselves and ask their question. So please feel free to do that now. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Oh, James, I see your hand up now. Go ahead and unmute yourself and.
There, I think, is my voice coming through? Okay.
Loud and clear.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Greetings, everyone. Bobby, in your presentation, you had asked a little bit about, I know part of the purpose is to consolidate a number of the policies, because, I don't know, or is policy the right word, or bylaw here? Anyway, the regulations. And I guess there was something that gave me the understanding that some of the zoning bylaw regulations in the villages could be consolidated with some of the rural regulations. Did I understand that correctly? Or were you saying that really, because the uniqueness of the different areas, that they should be separated?
Yeah, sure. Let me clarify that. So there's basically two options in front of us. One of them is that we can either merge the existing bylaws, so it'll be the new rural bylaw that we'll produce through this project, plus the Nobleton bylaw, plus the King City Schaumburg bylaw. So we have an opportunity to merge all of those into one kind of comprehensive township-wide bylaw. Even if we do that, we don't necessarily have to lose detail though. Like, we don't have to take away zones. We can keep the regulations in the villages as is, but it would just really be a matter of having a single document. It'll just be a longer document, I think. And then the other option is we keep them separate. And that has some pros and cons as well.
Okay, and I'm reassured to hear that, because I know the Hamlets are a unique situation, and I'm thinking of a number of the agricultural uses have unique situations and so on, and the size of lots, etc. So anyway, I'm just glad to hear that there can still be that sort of specific to different situations, basically.
Absolutely. We wouldn't want to take away any of the detail that we've developed through the prior zoning bylaws. That'll be, if we decide to consolidate them into one, we'll keep that detail moving forward for sure.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Bobby.
You're welcome. Good to see you again, by the way.
Yeah, you too.
Oh, I was muted and talking. Sandra, did you have a question that you perhaps wanted to run by the group, or I can read out the question that you've typed? Okay, perhaps I'll read it out to the group then. Okay, yeah, I'll read it out. So they ask, what is the anticipated zoning impact of the proposed transportation plan affecting the 17th Side Road as a regional road in Snowball? So perhaps I'll pass that to Kristen first, and presumably related to the transportation master plan.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the impact on the zoning, I'm not sure how much of an impact the transportation master plan will have on zoning in the area of Snowball, but it's something that we can definitely take a look at and report back on. Bobby, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we have to take a look at it for sure. I think generally speaking, zoning bylaws don't regulate public rights of way. So the areas that are largely addressed by the transportation master plan, within the public right of way, the zoning won't really affect it. So zoning is more about individual parcels of land. So I don't think that there will be a significant impact to the zoning from the transportation master plan. The one thing that might be considered is, if classifications of different roadways are changed, it kind of creates this question. Well, do the setbacks still make sense? When considering the future planned character of that right of way. So I think that would probably be the main implication of the transportation master plan on the zoning bylaw. I hope that helps, but feel free to type a follow-up if that wasn't clear.
Yeah, I guess Katie had a follow-up. What about the possibilities of local transit routes? Perhaps start with Bobby or Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, through the zoning review, there isn't an opportunity to, kind of revise any plans for local transit or anything like that. I don't know if Kristen, if you have any context to share just outside of the zoning review on that.
Not specifically, but transit is provided in York Region by the regional municipality of York. So it is more of a, if we're talking about like buses and things like that, it's through the region that they would plan for public transit routes. But in terms of like supporting local bike lanes or active transportation, that's something that the township is reviewing, and we have an active transportation master plan that we're looking at now, and that's also available on Speaking. So Katie, if you wanted to check out the Speaking page for the active transportation master plan, please do so and get involved in that project.
Sorry, I'm just wondering though, does the chance for rezoning actually kind of lean into these conversations about local transit routes? Because if you rezone an area, especially a rural area, or if you bring in, new uses to some of the smaller hamlets, will that cause, as kind of like all of these issues are connected, right? So I'm just wondering if this is part of the conversation that is actually happening when it comes to zoning as well. Like if there are plans connected with zoning that that do have visions of making some of the smaller hamlets more connected to the larger routes and systems that we already have in place. Because I don't know, in my opinion, it seems like that these things can't be done in silos. And so I'm just really curious as to whether or not this is being thought about.
Bobby, I'll pass that one to you maybe to start.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for the question. So it's an interesting point you're raising. I think generally there's kind of a pretty limited linkage between the zoning review process and transit. I think actually, Katie, just reflecting on some of your comments, I'm not too sure how familiar you are with the official plan, but the official plan is the document that the township uses to kind of set out a higher level framework for where growth is planned to occur, where land use changes might occur, where more intense uses are planned to occur, like for example, building up some density in some of the core areas of the villages, or near the GO station in King City, for example. That's really the role of the official plan, to kind of facilitate those conversations. And the township also produces, transportation master plans. It participates in York Region's processes as well. So yeah, I agree. I mean, all these things are absolutely linked. But the zoning review process, it's almost this implementation process where the vision for these areas is established in the official plan, And now we're going about the process of reviewing how the current zoning fits in with that vision. So I think, to respond to your question, definitely these things are considered in sort of a linked way, but the zoning review process, I think, is really taking a lot of its direction from the official plan. And I would say there's pretty limited linkage to transit, unlike the official plan. The official plan really is sort of that central document that just kind of brings everything together. And the zoning bylaw is one of many tools to implement that document.
Okay, thanks so much, Bobby.
If I can also add to that, Matt, just on Tuesday, the mayor had mentioned, it would be beneficial to have some sort of planning 101 materials just to help better explain kind of the linkage of all these different documents. Because, in just having this conversation, I think it probably is beneficial to talk about, what is the role of the zoning bylaw compared to some of these other documents, and where are we taking direction from, and how do these things fit together? The mayor kind of requested that on Tuesday, and that's something on our radar, and we do hope to update the website with some better planning 101 information that might help to kind of make these connections a bit clearer to you. So I hope that helps to answer your question, Katie.
Thanks, Bobby. Susan does have a question. Susan, did you want to read it out, or I'm certainly happy to do so? Perhaps. Okay, I can read it out. Perhaps a question for Bobby. So are you considering maintaining provincial plan terminology in the zoning nomenclature, such as the Oak Ridges Moraine and some of the Greenbelt designations? And if you look at the chat box, they're all listed there. So yeah, are you considering maintaining the provincial plan terminology in the zoning nomenclature?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's on the radar, and certainly in the Oak Ridges Moraine plan, especially when we think about how prescriptive that plan is, it probably does make sense to maintain that series of Oak Ridges Moraine zones, to show that really clear linkage to policy. In some of the other areas, I think that that's an option. We can have, different rural zones that reflect different policy areas. But it kind of depends on whether that's needed or not. At the end of the day, if the zones end up being really similar, like a zone for the Greenbelt Plan protected countryside area versus maybe a general rural zone outside of the Greenbelt Plan area, if those zones end up being pretty much the same, then we might as well merge them, and it probably wouldn't make sense to name it after the provincial policy that it's related to. But yeah, suffice it to say, I think that linkage to provincial plan terminology in the zones is definitely an option for how we'll name the zones moving forward. And we might even, and just thinking out loud, but we might even, I think currently the township has a zone that it typically uses in the Holland Marsh specialty crop area, but maybe there's a chance for us to rename that zone just so it's a lot clearer that it's related to the Holland Marsh specialty crop area.
Thanks, Bobby. I'm noticing we're losing a few people as we go, and so we do appreciate you sticking with us to this point. And if you do need to head out, again, thanks for joining us, and we encourage you to visit the speaking page where you can complete the survey, and a recording of this session will be posted online in coming weeks. So do stay tuned for that. Are there any other questions? Again, feel free to type in the chat box, or at this point, just unmute yourself and ask the group. Nancy, did you want? Oh, Nancy was just agreeing with the provincial plan terminology suggested by Susan. Did you want to speak to that at all, Nancy?
So I was hearing the answer, but I was thinking, it's still, I think it's a good idea to have the provincial plan terminology. And even if a neighboring area has similar restrictions, then you could sort of say, we're going to zone this to have the same restrictions as, and then use that same terminology. So I think it would emphasize more about the provincial terminology if you did use it, even if, you know, it didn't really apply to the neighboring area, but you were going to have the same kind of restrictions, then say so, rather than ignoring the provincial nomenclature. I like that idea. So that was just my comment.
Thanks for that comment. That's very helpful.
Agreed. Yeah, thanks, Nancy. We'll take that one away and ponder that a bit more for sure.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments or unmuted lines here. So perhaps I'll wrap up, and Kristen, Bobby, and I are going to be on the line till 8 o'clock. So if you wanted to hang back and ask a question afterwards, or if you didn't get a chance to ask it and maybe want to ask in a bit of a smaller group, we'll be here till 8. So, but by no means are we kicking you out at this point. So again, thank you to everyone who's been able to join us this evening. As Bobby said, you know, we wanted to take this opportunity to walk through the discussion paper and you know, present it here at this virtual public open house. We look forward to connecting with you in the new year. And in the meantime, please visit the project website on Speaking, which has all the information you may need to learn about the project, and it's some important contact information for next steps. And as I mentioned, a recording of this session will be posted on the website in the coming weeks. And we encourage you to fill out the survey and register for future project updates so we can be sure to stay in touch and provide the latest information. And with that does conclude sort of the formal open house. And have a great rest of your evening, and do take care. And as I said, we'll be here till 8 o'clock. So please, if you would like to speak or have a question, do feel free to hang back. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
So I see it says the open house video